Good morning to all of you around the globe who are attending today's webinar, the first online conference of the European Union Forum of Judges for the Environment. Welcome and hello from Brussels in Belgium. My name is Farah Boukel and I am in charge of the Secretariat of the EUFJE and an assistant in environmental law at the University of Ghent. On behalf of the EU Forum of Judges for the Environment, I would like to express my gratitude to all the speakers and the participants who have joined for today's online conference on the pressing matter of air pollution. I will be introducing you to our forum and covering some logistics for a few minutes before turning it over to Luc Lavreysen, the president of the forum. He will then introduce you to our distinguished speakers and be your moderator for today and for tomorrow. The EU Forum of Judges for the Environment was created in 2004. And the objective of the forum is to strive for a better implementation and enforcement of environmental laws. How? Among others, by training judges in environmental law and by sharing case law. The EU Forum of Judges for the Environment is a network of more than 100 judges and courts in 40 different countries. Many of our members are participating today. Membership is open to judges or courts who are interested in environmental law. And they can be administrative, civil, or criminal judges at all levels of the judiciary. We also cooperate closely with other networks of practitioners, such as IMPEL, the EU Network for the Implementation and Enforcement of Environmental Law, NP, the Network of Prosecutors for the Environment, and NV CrimeNet, the network of police officers working in environmental files. And this includes that we launch joint projects and conferences. You can find an overview of our activities and the reports of our past conferences and a treasure of documents and links on our new website, eufje.org. You can also find the program there for today and for tomorrow, and a draft summary report on air pollution written by Katalin Shuliok. I hope that today's conference will inspire you, support you in your important work, and give you a feeling, despite of these challenging times due to COVID-19, of belonging to one big environmental law community. But before concluding, let me explain a few logistical issues. In this Zoom webinar, you as an attendee can only view and listen to the webinar, but there are two key functions for you to keep an eye on. First, there is a chat box. So if you go to the bottom of your screen and you click on it, we may be posting information and links for you from time to time during the conference. You, however, cannot send messages via chat. As an attendee, you should use the Q&A function. You can put a question in there or alert us about any technical issues, and we will then do our best to work with you. The Q&A allows us to accumulate the questions for the Q&A session at the end of the conference, and we will be looking at all the questions and trying to select the most interesting and appropriate ones. Let me mention too that this conference is being recorded so that we can share it or that people can watch it after the conference. We will share the recording, the presentations of our speakers, and other documents on our website. For budgetary and organizational reasons this year, we do not provide interpretation English-French, so our apologies to our French-speaking members for that. The views expressed by our speakers are their views, not the official position of our network or of the European Commission, who is supporting our activities. And now I am pleased and honored to introduce you to Luc Lavreysen. He is the president of the EU Forum of Judges for the Environment. He is also the president of the Constitutional Court of Belgium, a professor in environmental law at the University of Ghent in Belgium, and a world-recognized expert in the field of environmental law. Luc, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Farah. So I would like to welcome all of you to this annual conference of the European Union Forum of Judges for the Environment. It is a special edition, different from all the former ones. A year ago, we decided to organize our annual conference on the topic of air pollution. And the Supreme Administrative Court of Germany, the Bundesverwaltungsgericht, would act as a host. And we started soon after the Helsinki conference with the preparations. But then in March, the new coronavirus deployed rapidly in Europe, and a pandemic was declared by the World Health Organization. Lockdowns have been introduced on large scale, and teleworking and video conferencing became our new daily reality. A lot of physical activities, seminars, conferences have been annulled, postponed, or transformed into virtual events. We followed the evolution of the pandemic closely, and towards the end of June, it became clear that our initial hope that we would be able to organize today and tomorrow a conference in the splendid premises of the Supreme Administrative Court of Germany and the lovely city of Leipzig was not realistic. So we decided to transform our conference in a digital event. This led, of course, to some important changes. We had to reduce our program because a digital conference of 1.5 full day would be a violation of Article 3 of the European Convention of Human Rights. We had also to annul the lunches, the dinner, and the social program, which are, of course, in normal times, an ideal moment of informal contact between our members, which is crucial for sustaining a smooth functioning of an organization as ours. We have nevertheless maintained the coffee pauses, but you must provide the liquids yourself, because it seems that Zoom cannot provide such a service digitally. The digital form allowed also to extend the invitation beyond the judiciary to attend the presentations of the different speakers. We have over 100 registered participants from all parts of the world and from many different organizations. We welcome in this respect participants from presidential offices, ministries, environmental protection agencies, prosecutors, offices, and universities from all over the globe. There is also a link between the theme of our conference and the pandemic. The lockdown measures have clearly showed that so-called normal human activities are causing the severe air pollution situation we find in different parts of the world. Air quality improved considerably during the lockdown in China, and you might have seen the spectacular photographs of the difference between normal air quality and the much better visibility during lockdown in cities in India or Pakistan. Sometimes children could, for the first time in their life, enjoy blue skies. And also in Europe, the air quality improved noticeably according to monitoring data. Unfortunately, the coronavirus has not brought lasting improvements because the pollution levels have been restored to nearly normal when the lockdown measures have been relaxed. So there's still a long way to go. The item of our conference is therefore timely. We are very happy that we have the first day presentations by Veronica Manfredi, the Director Quality of Life with DG Environment of the European Commission, and she will speak on the European Union air pollution legislation and policy. From Alina Novikova of the UNESCO Convention on Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution, and from Martin Adams, Head of Program with the European Environmental Agency on the scientific aspects of air pollution. Tomorrow, Dr. Katalin Suljok will present a general report on the questionnaires that have been answered by our members in 16 different European Union countries. As each year, our judges were asked to fill out a questionnaire with respect to air pollution law and jurisprudence in their respective countries. It provides a unique insight in the state of air pollution law and litigation in 16 European Union countries. Furthermore, there will be tomorrow presentations by Christoph Sobota on the case law of the Court of Justice of the European Union and from Thomas Weber on the German perspective. We will end the conference with a meeting of the General Assembly that can only be attended by our members. It is the first time that we are organizing a digital conference. We hope we will not encounter too much technical issues, and I am thankful to Farah Boukel for the whole preparation of the conference and to Lars de Vocht, the head of ICT of the Belgian Constitutional Court, for his technical assistance. I also want to acknowledge the European Commission and Impel who support the activities of our forum. With those words, I would like now to give the floor to Mrs. Veronica Manfredi. As indicated, she is the Director Quality of Life, which include air, water and industrial emissions of DG Environment of the European Commission. So please, Ms. Manfredi, you have the floor.
President Lavrisen, first of all, enormous thanks for having invited me to this event. As I was informally sharing with you just a few minutes before the start of this conference, I really believe it provides all of us with an incredibly timely opportunity to discuss, I would say, more broadly, the problems of environmental law implementation and zoom into air pollution, particularly, which indeed has been occupying also the headlines of a number of newspapers in the context of the COVID-19 pandemics, for the reasons that you have just reminded us all. It's an honor, it's a privilege to be with you all, and on behalf of the European Commission, I would like to really give you all a very, very warm welcome. It would have been fantastic indeed to get to know each other around a nice cup of coffee, especially at 9:30 on a Friday morning. It's not possible, but I hope this is just the beginning of a very committed and joint adventure where you will have seen the European Commission has really put a greener and more digital transformation of its economies and societies as the top of its political agenda. But let's start a little presentation. I know that Farah kindly will assist me for the display. So maybe we can already put the first slide on the screen. So after this one, where I wanted to zoom. So Farah, if we can move to the next slide. I wanted to basically zoom just a second on a very important aspect on which I believe Martin Adams, that is going to speak a little bit later, will also zoom further. A very recent report published indeed by the colleagues of the European Environment Agency as, I would say, really vividly stressed once again, something that we know, but to which we are increasingly putting figures. Unfortunately, environmental pollution is responsible for 1 in 8 deaths in Europe. This represents 13% on average across the EU, with only air pollution accounting, as we know, for around 500,000 every year of premature deaths. And I must say, I always put this in perspective with the horrible and tragic impacts that the COVID-19 pandemic has been having. As we know, we have unfortunately gone beyond the 1 million deaths across the world, but only in the EU, every year, not just in 2020, we are losing prematurely 500,000 people. And I must say, as we know, unfortunately, some of them are also people in very young ages linked to cancer issues. We also notice, and this is something that, of course, from a European law perspective and wider European policy perspective is difficult to swallow, very important difference between East and Western Europe. Figures are clear. We see peaks up to 27% of premature deaths in Romania, compared to 10% in Denmark and Sweden. Not one of these deaths is really acceptable, but still you see the divide. Not to speak about what we see beyond the EU. Bosnia and Herzegovina is here mentioned as an example, so similar high rate of mortality. So it also calls indeed for our very strong engagement internationally, and I'm very happy that the colleague from the UNICE transboundary UNICE Convention on Transboundary Air Pollution is with us and will be speaking later on. So can we move to the next slide? Where the focus is on the fact that we have, I would say, an overall robust regulatory framework in the European Union to monitor and cap air pollution. How does it work concretely? Well, first of all, we have the ambient air quality directives. You see them on the top of the slide. And as you know, they all set air quality standards as regards, in particular, concentration levels of pollutants in ambient air. And they regulate specific substances, the PM10, PM2.5, etc. Secondly, the second pillar is the National Emission Reduction Commitment Directive, which establishes this reduction commitment for each member state and for key pollutants, the ones that we see mentioned in the slide. So the sulfur dioxide, NOx, volatile organic compounds, and so on. Then we have a plethora, quite a big number of source-specific legislation, which looks at the way in which a number of economic sectors obviously produce pollution, and now we can cap this pollution at best. First of all, I would like to mention, and we will zoom specifically into it, the Industrial Emission Directive, which regulates over 50,000 of our largest industrial plants, but also the Eco Design Directive is of great relevance. And for example, it's the one that regulates, I would say, not only the energy efficiency, but indeed the progressively more moderate polluting impacts of, say, our heating and cooling systems in our public building, at home, and so on. Not to mention, of course, the Euro standards for car and other energy efficiency pieces of law. So we can move to the next slide, where I wanted to zoom a little bit more in the ambient air quality directives, which of course really set out key standards to protect human health and the environment. And I would like to stress, of course, they do so by taking into account the World Health Guidelines, and they really focus on the four key objectives of, first of all, setting common methods and criteria to assess the air quality in all the member states in as comparable and reliable manner as possible. This is the aim of the directive, but we will see in a moment that we have recognized some scope for improvement in this area. They also require, of course, our member state to set up sampling points and also monitoring network that enable us to measure and assess air quality in a thorough manner. And all these data, I want to stress, are then collected for us by the colleagues in Copenhagen, by Martin and the team, that enables us then to have accurate understanding of the state of clean air across the EU. We have a fantastic air quality index that provides us almost with real-time data. The second key important objective is that, of course, the directive really established standards for air quality for these key air pollutants we have seen in the previous slides that need to be attained by all the member states across their territory. And these are 12 well-defined air pollutants considered of particularly harmful nature, of course. Then the third aim of the directive is to require member states to prepare and implement air quality plans and measures in order to keep the exceedances and the period, I would say, of exceedances as short as possible. But the directive, and this is inbuilt, of course, in the nature of the instrument, indeed a directive that prescribes a result, well, it leaves a certain liberty to the member states as to the measure, the choice of the measures to be taken to define those plans. And fourthly, the directives require the member states to provide air quality information both to the Commission as well as to the stakeholders and to the general public. So this includes reporting of up-to-date air quality measurement as well as the results of annual air quality assessment. So this very important requirement of transparency in the way in which information of the actual state of air is transmitted to the public. So let's move to the next slide, because 2019 has been for our directorate a really important year. We have performed an important number of fitness checks, including the one on the ambient air quality directives. And this slide tries to encapsulate for you in a synthetic manner the 7 key lessons that we have learned in that context. What have we understood? First of all, that really the public support for securing that we have legislation, European legislation in place in this area is enormous. So this air quality remains, I would say, immediately after climate change, people's biggest health and environmental concern. Also, we have found out that overall the air quality standards as they are defined in the current acquis have been instrumental, but I would stress only partially effective in reducing pollution. We should never forget it. Back in 1990, 1 million people were prematurely dying out of pollution. In 2018, we have close to 500,000. So there is, I would say, a success story, but we all collectively agree it's still too much. It's still not going as well as it should. Of course, the positive side is, in the meantime, we have progressively shown that we are capable of decoupling economic growth from pollution, but certainly there is scope for accelerating the effectiveness of our actions. And also, I would say, clearly resounding a kind of constatation across the board that still the European Union is working in some very delicate contexts, such as for PMs, fine particulate, which are also the most harmful ones from a public health perspective, well below the scientific advice of the WHO. Now, one of the 7 findings that I would like to particularly highlight is the one where you see the little green arrow, because the fitness check concludes that the enforcement actions in front of the national courts in principle works. However, the effectiveness of this enforcement action is linked to the actual functioning of access to justice in the various national legal systems, as well, of course, the dynamism of the civil society representatives. And this points to the fact that unless we really have well-functioning access to justice in practice across all member states, this will never deliver all the results that are needed. And that's why, in parallel, the European Commission is adopting, actually in these very hours, normally next week, an important package to try and stimulate different action across the member states when it comes to access to justice. And we've also started a number of infringement procedures there where we found that the problems were persistent and structural. Maybe we can move to the next slide, Farah. I have already said a lot about access to justice, but the very many knowledgeable experts in the room that I cannot unfortunately see certainly could tell me, but as we know, there is no provision in the ambient air quality directives on access to justice, which is absolutely true. And we are so thankful, therefore, to the Court of Justice, once again, because it is the Court of Justice that, in reply to preliminary reference proceedings, has authoritatively interpreted the directive by granting natural or legal persons directly concerned by the exceedances of air quality standards the right to stand to bring an action before the courts, requiring therefore the competent authorities to take measures and bring those exceedances to an end. This stems from case law that is mentioned in the slide, Janacek, Client Earth, and shows really the crucial importance of the national court's work, of your own work, colleagues, for enforcing EU environment acquis. National court proceedings are really part of this implementation process in the member states, and they can indeed better help us in more directly responding to the punctual interests that appear nationally, locally, among citizens and civil society representatives. And of course, they also have wide powers which are granted upon them under national law, such as the ones of adopting injunctive measures, and where necessary also to make good the loss or the damage suffered by individuals whose rights stem from EU law. Yet, this is precisely an area where I would really appreciate if in the framework of this conference, opinions could be gathered from the participants as to whether you think that there is scope for having even more explicit kind of hooks in the EU acquis as such on air pollution, on the link to right to damages as well. We can move to the next slide. Where I wanted also to bring to the colleagues' attention another very important development at court level. So that because we have witnessed that the court has been expanding on previous case law in relation to air quality plans and has concluded in the Krajenes case that you see displayed on the screen, that in relation to air quality monitoring requirements, the national courts are empowered, first of all, to check if the monitoring network put in place by the relevant member states really satisfies the result obligation, the requirements which are laid forward in the Ambient Air Quality Directive. And also, if that is not the case, the judges can take all necessary measures vis-à-vis the competent authority to ensure that these requirements are correctly applied. I let you imagine what an important judgment this is in terms of really securing a much better practical implementation of the aims, of the stated aims of the directive. So we can move to the next slide, where essentially I also wanted to zoom on the fact that, of course, also the public enforcement, where the national court play a crucial role as the end part of the enforcement chain, is very, very important as well. So clearly a judge works well and particularly effectively there where other actors in what we call the chain of the compliance assurance system, the inspectors, the police, the prosecutors, and why not certainly civil society representatives themselves, are put in a position to really display their work properly. And so here, what is important to stress is that EU law empowers the national courts to see through the implementation of their judgment. And in particular, what we have seen in the Deutsche Umwelthilfe case that you see displayed on this slide is that the Court of Justice has outlined the extent of the powers of national courts to ensure that their decisions are implemented. What was the fact in this specific case? Basically that an holder of a public office was deemed responsible for a persistent lack of application of its duties stemming from the directive in terms of delivering an air quality plan. And the court had to look into the relevant national legislation applicable. In this case, it was German law, very restrictive, enabling basically to impose criminal sanction on the person which had failed to comply its duties. So possibility to put the person in jail. And the court has concluded that the national court indeed can and should use should look into this, the applicable national framework and see whether the application of the national code in this specific case is, I would say, proportionate, having regard, of course, also to the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So if it's if the gravity of the duty which has been breached, put in proportion with, of course, the right to liberty, is such that it is appropriate to apply the sanction as foreseen under national law or not. So it's a really, I would say, very, very, very important level of responsibility that is bestowed on the national judges in the appreciation also of the proportionate character of the sanctioning system put in place by the member states, even for this type of very punctual failures. So we can move to the next slide. Now, we have zoomed up to now a little bit more on the Ambient Air Quality Directive. Let's look a bit into what is the added value that brings to us the National Emission Reduction Commitment Directive. Here, I would like to basically mention again that we are in a very important phase of implementation, because since last year, all the member states are sending us their national air pollution control programs, and when they fail to do so, we have launched infringement proceedings. So we have created with this directive really an integrated governance system that is forcing each of the member states to look in a holistic manner into all the sources of air pollution and define measures to meet the commitment reduction targets that they have for 2020, 2030. It covers these 5 main pollutants: sulfur dioxide, ammonia, volatile organic compounds, nitrogen oxides, and fine particulate matter, and establishes really this nationwide obligation to report on these pollutant emissions and on how well the member states is progressively meeting its obligations. So it's really a very important governance instrument. Let's zoom now a little bit more also into what we have as source-specific legislation. We can move to the next slide, which I would like to stress from the outset is not exhaustive. Indeed, first of all, a little zoom into the Industrial Emission Directive. Well, sorry, I should say into the industrial emission as such. The slide points to 3 key instruments that we manage under European law to control the industrial emission. The first and most important one clearly is the Industrial Emission Directive of 2010, through which we have created a unique architectural governance system where member states, industrial owners, and civil society together collectively look into best available technologies on a periodic basis, constantly capping down the level of emission coming from industrial plants, and therefore leading to a very dynamic mechanics to constantly improve the performance of our 52,000 largest industrial plants across the EU. But we also have the Medium Combustion Plants Directive, and we also have the specific regulation on a European Pollutant Release and Transfer Register, which essentially is an instrument to enhance the transparency of the information about from where the emissions come, from which industrial plants. But you will see in the next slide, we are now looking into how to secure an even more effective way of looking into this transparency of the emission reporting. We can move to the next slide, Farah, because here we zoom indeed a little bit more into what the Industrial Emission Directive does. I would say we don't need to enter into all these details because I've largely already given you the crux. What matters to me is the next slide, which shows to you the findings of the evaluation of the Industrial Emission Directive that we've just published. It has been published at the very beginning of September this year. And the four main highlights I would like to bring to you is, first of all, that the evaluation clearly has concluded that this directive has been overall effective in cutting considerably the level of industrial pollution, especially into air. To be mentioned amongst all others, we have managed to reduce by 70% the level of SOx emitted between the 2008 and 2018 period. But I would stress, on the one hand, there is scope for even further cutting pollution coming from industrial plants to water and to soil. And we also see that the directive could better contribute to decarbonization and circular economy concerns, so better resource efficiency in industrial processes. This is a limitation of the instrument itself when it comes to decarbonization, because we have an article in the directive that basically exclude from its scope the capturing of greenhouse gases, and it was the result at the time, back in 2010, of a political wish of the co-legislators. You know that we have the ETS, a market-based instrument to cut greenhouse gases coming from industries, but today with the climate neutrality goal set forward by President von der Leyen and fully endorsed by the majority of our member states, we are really asking ourselves questions as to whether we should not use this instrument to better capture greenhouse gases also from industries as such. As I was hinting to, the other second point is that clearly the evaluation has shown that the majority of our stakeholders do see the directive as a unique and positive governance model of co-creation of standards. And also when it comes to understanding what are other areas for improvement, well, we see potentialities in the light of the replies we've received from stakeholders to widen its scope, for example, to capture more emissions coming from more agro-industrial installations, so farming activities whose size is such that the amount of pollutant emissions to air, soil, and water is significant and may deserve being captured under this instrument. As I said, the better integration of the decarbonization, resource efficiency aspect, but also, interestingly, a demand by several stakeholders to secure better public information, enhanced participation of civil society in decision-making, so the transparency requirement that stem all from HARUS at the end of the day. And this is why we've taken the decision to link the ongoing review of the Industrial Emission Directive to a review also of the European Pollutant and Release Transfer Register regulation, which indeed enhances the possibility for us to give better access to the public on from where the emissions come, how they're reported, etc. We can move to the next slide. This one essentially tries just to give you a snapshot, and I will not even mention the titles, into the plethora, as I mentioned before, of EU-specific source legislation for transport, for energy, for fuels. What you may see is that we didn't mention very much agricultural sources. Indeed, I must say, this is an area where I believe there is scope for being a little bit more robust. We have certain capturing of agricultural emissions, indeed, when the farming activity rises to the size of what would fall within the scope of the Industrial Emission Directive. So when it becomes really an agro farming industrial plant, but maybe there is scope for doing a little bit more in this context. We also have a mechanic inbuilt in the CAP, our Common Agricultural Policy Instrument, whereby certain funding to farming activity cannot be granted unless there is evidence by the beneficiary of the funding that efforts are done in order to cut pollution and in general drive farming activities over towards more sustainable models. As you know, by the way, the new CAP is still being discussed by Council and Parliament, and we are in rather crucial stages. So, voila, this is an area which is evolving and to which the European Commission is very committed. We have published in May a farm to fork strategy that really looks into how to cut emissions from pesticides, fertilizers, and also other practices that end up, amongst other, into important pollution of our air. So let's move to the next slide, where I wanted to zoom, because I thought it could have been of wider concern, into the fact that we are currently about to finalize the REFIT evaluation also of the Environmental Crime Directive. I understand from colleagues that if everything goes according to plan, it will be published by the end of this month. Now, the Environmental Crime Directive is really an important instrument because it looks into situations where environmental law allows or actually requires member states to set criminal penalties for a number of breaches. And together with the colleagues in DG Justice, who are, let's say, the main managers of this important piece of law and in charge in general with criminal justice aspects, we are looking into whether there is scope for expanding its scope of application to a wider number of offenses to EU law, including strengthening requirements for air pollution. This is still a work in progress, so I will not enter into too many details, but just to flag it for your attention, because there will also be, as always when the European Commission starts reviews of existing acquis, possibilities for you to intervene. We will publish public consultation, roadmaps, to which we always welcome the feedback from outside stakeholders, and I would be delighted if the European Forum of Justice for the Environment would come up also with a proper position paper on this aspect. So we can move to the next slide, where I just tried to, you know, encapsulate in a single little piece of paper the very many instruments that we manage under international law that are all looking into how to capture better pollution, including into the air. And of course, a special place to the UNICE Convention on the long-range transboundary air pollution and its related protocols. The colleague who will speak after me will enter into this more granularly, but we are in a very important stage because the review also of the Gothenburg Protocol on the abatement of acidification, eutrophication, and ground level ozone is entering into rather crucial stages. These conventions are so important to us because they enable us to engage in cooperation with Western Balkan, Caucasian region, so many other countries in our immediate neighborhood that really play an important role in securing that we all attain the highest possible level of compliance with the ambition that we have. And as you know, for the European Union, currently the level of ambition is nothing less than a zero pollution ambition, jointly with the climate neutrality targets. So the ambitions are really important and high. Other instruments are mentioned here, but I will not enter into them. Maybe just a specific word of mentioning for MARPOL, the MARPOL Convention. We all know how much maritime emissions coming from the maritime sector are still perceived also politically as not being sufficiently well covered. This is an area that traditionally, like aviation, these are sectors that are seen as truly global ones and requiring international commitments. But I must tell you that in the current stage, unless we see movements, I don't exclude that more stringent measures might be taken just from the EU. So always a tension between trying to find agreement internationally and at the same time securing that the European Union stays in a leading position on cleaner technologies. Let's move to the next slide, which actually comes at the right point in time because I was kind of alluding to the bigger European Green Deal ambition and the bigger picture in which we are moving. You will see that not by coincidence, increasing the EU climate ambition for 2030 and climate neutrality 2050, and on the right hand, the zero pollution ambition, stay there on the top. Somehow there are two arms of the one concept that our president expressed so well back in July 2019 when she got appointed, and she said, we need a healthy planet for healthy people. If we were to cut all the greenhouse gases as such, which we all want to do, we could save the planet, but if we don't cut in parallel pollution, we may continue to witness yearly a huge amount of diseases, including mental health ones, not to mention so many other diseases that fragilize our population, in particular children and elderly people. So this is clearly not the model of society towards which the European Union is working. We are part of a very big picture where all the sources of pollution are being looked at. You see clean, affordable energy, mobilizing industry for a cleaner and circular economy, building and renovating in a more efficient way. The Renovation Wave initiative is going to be adopted by the college next week, preserving nature, restoring biodiversity, the farm to fork strategy for revamping our food chains, accelerating the shift to sustainable and smart mobility. all the sources that lead ultimately to air pollution process are for the first time, I think, in the development of European Union policies being looked at and put as top political priorities, and these together with financial and I would say also cultural, societal accompanying mechanism, which are the Just Transition Fund and the Sustainable Finance Schemes, next to the recovery and resilience plans that we are asking now member states to deliver in spring next year in order to benefit of the important amount of money just decided by our, just being discussed actually still by our heads of state and the parliament in the framework of the Next Generation EU to drive a new recovery. We can move to the next slide, but I would say very shortly because I realize that time is really running. Here just to say, my directorate, the directorate for which I have the honor to work and the honor to lead, we will be fully working throughout the end of this year and the next towards delivering what we call this Zero Pollution Action Plan for air, water and soil. Again, delighted if you can closely follow our activities. Important components of this action plan will of course be already mentioned revision of the Industrial Emission Directive, the adoption now normally next week of the chemical strategy for sustainability to start really building a less toxic environment. And when it comes to ambient air quality, key aspects of concern will be looking into how to secure that our air quality standards get much closer to the recommendations that are about to come next year by the World Health Organization, and securing an enhanced, even better functioning comparability of data coming from our member states. Let's move to the next slide, which simply synthetically depicts to you the 4 pillars of our action plan. As you see, the first one, the one on which I count very much on your continued and passionate cooperation, is strengthening the implementation and the enforcement even of the existing acquis. And of course, as I said, there is a part that is looking into how modernizing and making the existing acquis even a bit more effective, but I would like to stress it's important yet still surgical changes compared to the skeleton of the regulatory framework that we have in place that by and large has proven to be rather effective. Integrated governance, this is for me very important when it comes to zero pollution, because we know for a fact that we're looking at pollution in the light of so many angles, that we need an integrated governance framework to really secure a more consolidated and macro indicated amount of pollution for air, water and soil that can be translated into more robust political messages for our decision makers at all levels. And of course, this will require quite a lot of efforts, not just for us, but in cooperation with everyone, to drive economic, societal, and I would add cultural mindset shift, because it's really, as the President said it, about the way in which we live, we produce, we consume, we move. So it's really important changes that are permeating our societies. We can move to the next slide. And we're getting really close to the end. Well, I think we can skip this one. I've already mentioned how holistic is the approach. Yes, let's not, I think in the interest of time, I mean, this is a collection of all the activities that we have been carrying out, by the way, in this COVID period, working like all of you in teleworking and delivering assessment of the national energy climate plans, a new strategy for smart energy sector integration, the renovation wave, which is coming next week, kicking off work for a possible revision of the Renewable Energy Efficiency Directive. We're close to finalizing a new initiative to boost sustainable production of energy offshore. So in our across our seas as a new form of clean energy, but of course how to do it in a way that it doesn't destroy the seabed or has other negative environmental impact. This is what is being discussed by the college in these weeks. So as you see, plenty of work strands that are all important pieces of the puzzle towards building a cleaner energy system for Europe. We can move to the next slide, which is looking more into transport, and then indeed we can further move, because I think, voila, you will see appearing all what is being, what is boiling in the drawers of the European Commission to try and rethink a more sustainable future in the way we move. So first of all, in these hours, we're finalizing the new strategy for sustainable and smart mobility. Normally, it will see the light in early December at the very latest. We are revising CO2 emissions performance legislation. We're in that context, the discussions are taken as to whether we need a Euro 7 standard for our cars to make them even cleaner. The emission trading scheme, the ETS I was referring to, is being currently reviewed precisely with a view to extend it to the maritime sector, and also with a view to reduce the free allowances for airlines. Discussions are being made in order to deploy over 1 million public charging points for electric cars and electric vehicles by 2025, and so many other measures, but we'll not enter into all of them. So we can move to the next slide. Agriculture, here is the zoom, farm to fork. And what have we said in this strategy? That we really want to cut significantly the use of chemical pesticides, fertilizers, and antibiotics. And at the same time, right now, whilst the CAP as such is still not adopted, member states are working to start drafting their national strategic plans, which will be the conditio sine qua non for each of their economies to receive actually CAP funding as such. So we hope that the co-legislators' work, which is still in the finalizing stages, will lead us to a sufficiently ambitious outcome, because of course the more ambitious the outcome will be, the more the draft national strategic plans will have to really accompany an important shift into enhanced sustainability. Let's move to the next slide, which is really to also tell you there are opportunities where I would love to see judges more present. For enhanced interaction we want to undertake with decision makers at local level, mayors, but also, you know, people working in municipalities across the board, and that are in charge with managing air quality standards, water, nature and biodiversity, urban greening, circular economy, waste management, noise. This is the Green City Accord. It will be officially launched by Commissioner Sinkevicius on the 22nd of October at the margin of the upcoming Green Week that will all be devoted on biodiversity. As I said, plenty of space for cooperation between you and the mayors and the local actors. My last slide is just to tell you a very big thank you. I've been very long, hopefully not boring, and looking forward to continued cooperation. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Director Manfredi, for giving us a very comprehensive overview of existing European Union policy and law, but also giving us a flavor of the important new developments in the framework of the European Green Deal. I have pointed maybe 2 points we should not forget. The first one is I think we can share with our membership, making a link on our website towards the evaluation report of the Industrial Emission Directive. And secondly, your call to give some input in the refit procedure for reviewing the eco-crime directive. So this has been well noticed, so we will take this on board, I believe. So thank you very much for your presentation and your time. And now we have to move to Pan-Europe, to the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe in Geneva. It's one of the 5 regional commissions of the United Nations. And I think it's probably the only one who is very intensively working on the issue of air pollution with the Geneva Convention and relating protocols. So we are very happy that Mrs. Alina Novikova will give us insights on the developments in Pan-Europe. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, President Laversen. Good morning, dear panel speakers, and good morning, everyone. As it has been already introduced, I work at UNECE, which hosts the Secretariat for the Convention on Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution. And I would like to ask Ms. Buchel to display the slides. Thank you very much. So the convention, as we call it shortly, the Air Convention, is the oldest multilateral environmental agreement, which was signed in 1979, and last year it celebrated its 40th anniversary. It also became the first international treaty to deal with air pollution on a broad regional basis. Today it joins 51 parties across North America, Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. And almost all UNECE member states, with very few exceptions, are parties to the UNECE Air Convention. And as of now, the convention is only open for ratification to UNECE member states. So this is a framework convention which is extended by 8 protocols. And these protocols, they contain specific obligations to reduce emissions of particular pollutants. And the European Union is party to 7 of these protocols. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the Air Convention is the framework convention. So it lays down the general principles of international cooperation for air pollution abatement. And in line with its provisions, parties shall endeavor to limit and gradually reduce and prevent air pollution, including long-range transboundary air pollution. Secondly, they have to develop their own national policies and strategies that include air quality management system and, as part of it, control measures using the best available technologies. And thirdly, they have to exchange emission data as well as information on control technologies, policies, and strategies they are being implementing, and data related to effects of long-range transboundary air pollution. Next slide, please. The Air Convention sets up an institutional framework which brings together science and policy. And as you see from this slide, the network of scientific centers and task forces under the convention is really extensive. The executive body, which is the decision-making body, and it's called Meeting of the Parties or Conference of the Parties in other conventions, its work is supported by 3 main subsidiary bodies. The EMAP steering body and the Working Group on Effects constitute a scientific backbone of the convention. And actually the EMAP program, the EMAP, the full name of it is the Cooperative Program for Monitoring and Evaluation of the Long-Range Transmission of Air Pollutants in Europe. This program was created even before the convention was signed. It was created under the auspices of UNECE in 1977, when countries decided to tackle the problem of air pollution, acid rain, and dieback of forests. So currently the EMAP is dealing with the atmospheric monitoring and modeling, emission inventories and projections, and integrated assessment. So it provides governments with information on emission, on transport, and deposition of pollutants. This includes information on quantity and significance of the long-range transmission of air pollutants and fluxes across boundaries. And the work of the MAP is supported by 5 program centers and task forces. The working group on effects, it deals with information on degree and geographical extent of the impacts of major air pollutants on human health, on different ecosystems and materials. So its work is supported by 6 international cooperative programs, 1 task force on health, which is co-led with the World Health Organization, and 1 joint expert group. And finally, the working group on strategies and review, which is the principal negotiating body of the convention that negotiates new protocols or amendments to the existing protocols, agrees on guidance documents, and supports the work of the executive body on all policy-oriented matters. Next slide, please. So the first protocol that was adopted under the convention was the protocol on MAP, which is actually not a protocol that contains obligations to reduce emissions. It's just a financial mechanism, financial scheme to fund activities of this MAP program. And I should also say that all information under MAP, the emission data and results of the modeling are available in free access, and all links can be found on the website of MAP, and websites, each center under MAP also has their own websites where you can find all information you may need. Next slide, please. On the next slide, I list 4 old protocols of the Air Convention that are still in force. So as you know, all negotiations under the convention and negotiation of the convention itself started with the problem of acid rain and acidification of rivers and lakes. So this is why it is logical that the first protocol agreed was the protocol on sulfur, which contained a flat reduction rate for all the parties, 30% reduction by 1993. But then with the time, it became clear that in order to reduce acidification, other pollutants had to be taken into account. And this is when the protocol on nitrogen oxides was agreed on. And it was clear that nitrogen compounds not only contribute to acidification, but also have a eutrophying effect, which also caused ecosystem damages and changes. Then subsequently, there was a protocol on volatile organic compounds agreed when it was clear that VOCs also contribute to the formation of ground level ozone that causes damages to vegetation and crops. So all these 3 protocols have the same approach. They tackle single pollutants, and they have a flat rate of reduction. With the 4th protocol, the 1994 protocol on sulfur, there has been a new approach established, and which was like a turning point in the history of the convention, because all the emission reduction obligations were differentiated for different parties. And these reduction obligations were based on the modeling results. The results of modeled linkages between the SO2 emissions of each country and the exposure of different ecosystems, take into account the sensitivity of such ecosystems to acidification. So this approach allowed for achieving better results with less cost for every country, and this this opened the door to true polluter pays burden sharing. Next slide, please. On this slide, the key protocols to the convention are listed. The protocol on heavy metals and the protocol on persistent organic pollutants, which was mentioned by the previous speaker, these are quite important protocols that obviously tackle heavy metals and POPs, and paved the way to the global agreements such as the Stockholm Convention on POPs and the Global Convention, Minamata Convention on Mercury. The flagship protocol of the convention is the protocol to abate acidification, eutrophication, and ground level ozone, or as we call it, Gothenburg Protocol, was first negotiated and signed in 1999. And it became a turning point again and in the history of the convention, because this protocol, it follows the multi-pollutant, multi-effect approach. Because with the time it was recognized that various pollutants, they interact in the atmosphere, and they lead to combined impacts, and which are often caused by the same sources. And building on the cost effectiveness and effect-based principles, the Gothenburg Protocol comprises specific national emission ceilings for sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, ammonia, and volatile organic compounds. Then in 2012, when the Gothenburg Protocol was revised, it became the first binding agreement to also include emission reduction commitments for fine particulate matter, PM2.5. And parties also broke new ground for the first time in international air pollution policy by specifically including black carbon as part of particulate matter, which is the short-lived climate pollutant, and reducing particulate matter, including black carbon, through the implementation of the Gothenburg Protocol is thus a major step in reducing air pollution, while at the same time facilitating climate and health co-benefits. So in the descriptive text next to each protocol, I added the main obligations contained under each protocol. Speaking about the Gothenburg Protocol, the original Gothenburg Protocol 99 version formed the basis for the original NEC directive of the European Union. And when the protocol was revised in 2012, and the reduction commitments established for 2020 for the European Union and its member states have been transposed into the European Union law by the new directive on national emission reduction. Next slide, please. I would like to say a couple of words of about the success of the convention and its protocols. As a result of the collective effort over the last 30-40 years, the result has been remarkable. Emissions of a series of harmful substances have been reduced by 40 to 80% since 1990 in the region. In particular, the decrease in sulfur emissions has led to healthier forest soils. Particulate matter concentrations at European measurement sites declined by around a third between the year 2000 and 2012. The number of days exceeding the WHO guideline levels of ozone concentrations is now about 20% lower than in 1990. And the decoupling of economic growth and air pollution trends has prevented 600,000 premature deaths annually in Europe and North America. And the average life expectancy in the region has increased by 12 months thanks to emission reductions. Next slide, please. I have already mentioned, and I won't stay long on this slide, that parties, first of all, have to develop their own national policies and strategies, including their air quality management system. Their reduction commitments are calculated based on the concept of critical loads and levels. So this is they're summarized for use in the integrated assessment modeling employed to provide guidance for setting these emission reduction commitments. And critical levels of ozone and PM for human health are determined in accordance with the WHO air quality guidelines. in addition to these commitments, the parties have to also implement emission limit values. These are permissible, these are specific standards, permissible quantity of a pollutant contained in the waste gas from a specific installation. And in order to help parties to comply with their obligations, and you can please change the slide. There is a range of guidance documents prepared by different scientific and technical groups under the convention that help parties on how in identifying how these reductions can be achieved. And as you see, for example, for the Gothenburg Protocol, for implementation of the Gothenburg Protocol, you can see different types of documents prepared to tackle emissions of particulate pollutants from a specific source, like, for example, sulfur, NOx, and VOC, and particulate matter from stationary sources, or ammonia from agriculture, and it's like particulate matter and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons from wood burning, and also there is a new guidance document that will be presented for adoption in December, which is the guidance document on integrated approach to nitrogen management that actually goes beyond the scope of the Gothenburg Protocol. And if you change the slide, there are similar guidance documents prepared for implementation under the Heavy Metals Protocol and the Protocol on Persistent Organic Pollutants. Next slide, please. So I have talked about achievements and success of the convention and its protocols, but despite that, there are new challenges being emerged, and in order to recognize them and to tackle them, the parties have adopted a couple of years ago a new long-term strategy for 2020-2030 and beyond, and specified the key directions and key strategic priorities and tasks for all the bodies under the convention. I have mentioned that almost all UNEC member states are parties to the convention. However, not all of them are parties to the convention protocols that actually contain specific emission reduction obligations. And here I talk about mostly parties in Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. There are very few of them who are parties to the convention protocols. And this is why one of the priorities of the convention will be, it is currently right now, but also will be in the future, is the increased ratification and implementation of the convention protocols by countries in this region. And for this reason, there has been a capacity building program established under the convention to help these countries with developing their emission inventories and implementing best available technologies, etc. Then, as the previous speaker mentioned, now with the Gothenburg Protocol new amendment being enforced, the parties have triggered a review of efficiency and effectiveness of this protocol. And they will see whether, as a result of this review, they will see whether a new revision of this protocol will be needed or not. And by doing so, they will take into account the new challenges that are being emerged. For example, model simulations indicate that background levels of ozone will continue to grow after 2020-2030, driven progressively by methane emissions. So this type of information, also the need, for example, to maybe take into account the emissions from shipping or other aspects, or the fact that there is a bulk of pollution that is brought from outside the ECE region. These aspects will all be considered during the review of the Gothenburg Protocol. And also it has been widely recognized by the convention community that there should be an improved cooperation with other countries, with other regions and organizations to increase synergies and to enhance outreach and to share information accumulated under the AIR Convention. Next slide, please. So with the increase of the number of protocols, overseeing parties' compliance with their protocol obligations became increasingly complex. And for this reason, in 1997, the Convention's Implementation Committee has been established. It consists of 9 parties that delegate their experts, and there is a mix of legal and technical emission technical expertise within this committee. And most of the potential non-compliance cases are triggered by the Secretariat. I would say 98% of all the cases are triggered by the Secretariat. The rest of the cases can be sometimes triggered by parties themselves when they submit a case of potential non-compliance of their own, or for example of another party, which happens really rarely. So the committee reviews compliance, first of all, with the substantive obligations to reduce emissions under specific protocols, and with reporting obligations under these protocols. And we, as the Secretariat, we trigger cases based on the data provided by the MAP Center on Emission Inventories and Projections. And all these emission data is transparent. It is easily accessible by everyone at the website of this center. And then we start, as soon as we identify a potential case of non-compliance, we start communicating with the party concerned to check whether it has been perhaps a mistake in the calculation made, or indeed the party recognizes that there has been a substantive reason for the emission to go up and to exceed the emission ceiling identified. So based on this information collected by the Secretariat, the committee considers each case, and then the ultimate objective of it is not to blame and shame the parties, whereas to help them. For example, if there is a problem with calculation, we can refer them to emission experts under the convention to help them with the emission inventories. Or if there is indeed a substantive reason for that, to look at in depth, like what are the systemic barriers for parties to compliance. So that's it briefly about the compliance review under the convention. And if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Novikova, for introducing us in this very important AIR Convention and its additional protocols. I believe that this is a piece of legislation which is not so well known by the judiciary. So thank you for giving us an idea about what is in that convention, its importance, and also to the perspectives for future activities. So I'm looking now to the time. We are just 5 minutes late, which is very good. So now we will have our pause, coffee or tea or something else, of 15 minutes. So we will start 5 minutes behind schedule back for the third presentation. And meanwhile, so if you have questions, so use the Q&A so that we can raise questions for the panel at the end of the morning. So thank you and see you after the break. Okay, I hope you enjoyed the break. And now we will turn to the last speaker of the morning, Martin Adams, who is head of the program Health and Sustainable Resource Use of the European Environmental Agency. which is based in Copenhagen and which is supporting the European Union, European Commission, from a scientific point in developing and enforcing environmental policies. And of course, environmental pollution, air pollution, has a very important scientific component. And we are very happy that Mr. Adams accepted to give a presentation to us, we simple lawyers, not scientists. So please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and a very good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to join you for this session today on air pollution. You should now be able to see the slides from my side. I would very much like to present a snapshot of information that has been prepared by the colleagues at the European Environment Agency to you. But just as one word of introduction, many of you know about our work already and was kindly just introduced. Air pollution is one of the key areas that we do work upon at the European Environment Agency. You can just, for those of you who are perhaps not so familiar with us as an institution, you can just see on the slide here some information about what we do and what we do not do within the EU setting. Personally, I would say in the field of air pollution, the colleagues are working across 3 different areas. One is, as we've heard already from Veronica this morning, we very much support the member states and the European Commission with the processing of information which is reported under the air quality directives. A second important function that we do have is then using that information, creating reports and disseminating that knowledge to a broad range of stakeholders. And the third element is we do have a very strong networking role, working with different partners across Europe, including the Convention on Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution, but also, of course, with the many experts across the member states and our additional member countries. What I would like to do, very much as Veronica did actually as well, is to start off with the why does it matter perspective, and very much using health as an entry point for this presentation. Across Europe, we see at the moment there is a range of around 8 years difference in life expectancy across different countries. And this chart shows the life expectancy versus GDP per capita. And from this information, it's very clear that health outcomes are poorer in poorer members of our community in our poorer countries. So whether we like it or not, it's very clear that wealthier nations have better health outcomes at the population level, whereas poorer people, as you see on the slide here, typically live shorter lives, have poorer self-perceived perceptions around their health status and more long-term problems. I'm very happy Veronica showed our slide as well in her presentation, because this is a key piece of information that 1 in 8 deaths, as she also mentioned, have been linked by the World Health Organization to environmental pollution in Europe. And you can see here the range from around 10% in the least affected member states up to around 30%. There is a very strong east-west difference as well. And if you also think about the order in which countries have joined the European Union, we typically see more recent members of the Union are in fact having worse health outcomes and more impact from environmental factors on the population's health in those areas. Of those environmental factors that lead to health impacts, air pollution is very clearly the #1 environmental risk factor in Europe. We've seen these numbers before. Around 400,000 people die every year early because of air pollution. And more importantly, air pollution is linked to a number of specific non-communicable diseases. So whether it's from lung cancer, from heart disease, from stroke, there is a significant and appreciable proportion of premature deaths that are linked back to this specific environmental factor. I would also say here as well that when it comes to exposure to poor levels of air quality, we often see in the news media instances where air pollution is peaking in what are so-called episodes. Many of you will have seen the images from Paris, for example, in the last few years, where in the springtime there is a very strong haze and the air quality is a very visible problem. However, it's actually the long-term exposure to air pollution which harms health the most. So it's the long-term frequent exposure to lower levels of air pollution which is leading to some of these adverse health outcomes that we see. Now, our knowledge, as in many fields, is always improving, which is a definite positive, of course. There are a number of documented ways in which air pollution harms our health. You saw some on the previous slide, whether it was contributing to cancers, contributing to heart disease, respiratory disease is of course something that many of us will have family members perhaps with asthma, and in times of high air pollution, we know air pollution can be a trigger. The knowledge, as I said, is further improving, and at the moment the World Health Organization is undertaking a review of the health impacts of air pollution with a view to revising their air quality guidelines, which are set, basically health-based guideline values set in order to protect human health. And it's very clear that research from the last decade, for example, shows that air pollution is affecting us at levels lower than was previously thought important. So these sorts of findings we will expect to see coming through in the WHO's work, which is due to, well, hopefully conclude by around 2022, in a couple of years' time. Why are the WHO guideline values important? This chart shows the percentage of our population in the EU that lives in city areas which are exposed to air pollution above, on the left, the EU limits and target values for selected pollutants, and on the right, against the stricter WHO guideline values. The EU limit values, as we all know, were politically negotiated levels that were set back in 2008 or earlier in several instances. And we see here that for the pollutants responsible for harm to most health, the fine particulate matter, PM, up to around 20% of us who are living in Europe's cities are exposed to levels that exceed the EU's limit value for that pollutant. The WHO guideline values are stricter. They are much more orientated towards health-based values set to protect health from exposure to these pollutants. And here you see on that basis, up to 80% of Europe's urban population are exposed to levels of fine particulate matter. And this is important. Veronica mentioned very clearly the relevance and the importance of the European Green Deal package of the Commission. And one of the commitments within there is to move Europe's air quality standards closer to the World Health Organization limits. And so that's something certainly from the agency perspective, we expect will be a very interesting process in discussing that with member states across the next few years. However, the situation is improving. This chart shows you the concentrations of these key selected pollutants in air across Europe around the last, well, since the year 2000, as you see on the slide in front of you. What we see, of course, is a downwards trajectory for almost all the pollutants, well, all the pollutants that you see here. So this is a clear reflection of these improvements that are being delivered by policy implementation, particularly. We do see peaks. You can see the green line there, which corresponds to ground level ozone, does have very significant peaks in certain years. And that is because this particular pollutant is formed in the atmosphere and this really forms more strongly in years where there are high sunshine conditions. So where we have very sunny conditions, particularly across Southern Europe, in certain years, we do see these very high spikes of ozone. But generally for most pollutants, and importantly for fine particulate matter as well, there is a slow but steady progress and reduction of the amount of these pollutants in the air that we breathe. Now, this is a chart from our forthcoming Air Quality in Europe report, which is an annual report we produce. This information is shown on the map that you see, is based on the official monitoring stations that are reported to us by the member states and other countries across Europe. The red dots that you see show those monitoring locations that are exceeding the relevant EU limit value. In this case, it's a daily limit value for PM10. What we saw in 2018, which is the last year of verified data that we presently have to work with, 20 countries, 20 member states reported exceedances of the EU limit value. And it's very clear there are a particular couple of hotspots, one in Eastern Europe and one in Northern Italy. And there's different reasons for this. In Eastern Europe, we know the fine particulate matter in the atmosphere is particularly contributed to by burning of solid fuels for household heating. So this is burning of, say, coal and wood by households, but also use of solid fuels in industry sectors as well. In Northern Italy, it's a different combination of reasons. One is particularly wood burning. This is, one of the sort of main important sources of household heating in that region, but also the geographical location. This is the Po Valley in Northern Italy, of course. It's a combination of the geographical region which captures air pollution, a combination of the traffic, the industry, combined with wood burning, which is causing elevated levels in that area. Just showing the same information now to you, but in a slightly different way. This is a slide prepared by the colleagues that shows the spread of measurement values for each country. The red line that you see is corresponding to the same EU limit value as was indicated by the red dots on the previous slide. And so here you do really see the breadth of concentrations that are reported by different European countries, and also significantly for a number of member states, you know, a large proportion of measurements are still above this EU limit value. If I shift now to a different pollutant, which is also very important for the discussions that I understand will also come tomorrow in terms of implementation cases. Nitrogen dioxide, we know, is a pollutant, particularly important in urban areas. It's produced predominantly in those areas by transport sources, road traffic particularly. And you can see here, we've noted cases in Europe, on average, around 60% of the NO2 in cities is coming from road transport, but it's much higher in some cities. And very much compared to the previous map, where we saw hotspots of PM, here the exceedances of NO2 are much more widespread. And this is these dots, the red dots that you see, very much map in many cases onto these cities across Europe, the largest cities that have a high proportion of transport and traffic related activity. And again, this is a very similar technical plot, just showing the spread of concentrations. And you see here, you know, the number of these spikes above the red line corresponding to the limit value. It's very significant. There are a large number of countries that still are reporting exceedances of this NO2 limit value. Now, this is a rather complex chart, but it's one of the ones we find actually indicates or illustrates a couple of very important concepts when it comes to air pollution, and particularly the sources from which it's coming from. The slide is a couple of years old now, but the main messages still are very much valid today. And you see the situation for 3 different countries across Europe, selected countries. So the Netherlands, Germany, Poland, going from left to right. And the bars show the different contributions made to fine particulate matter in city environments. If we look at the Netherlands example, we see across the bottom axis, there are different sources, sources of particulate matter to the measured concentrations in cities. So some of the concentrations that are measured at a monitoring station, of course, are coming from the street itself. There's a contribution from elsewhere in the city. The urban contribution is an important contribution from other national sources in that country. And very importantly, in the case of the Netherlands, you can see by the size of the bar here for the international component, actually most of the PM measured in cities across the Netherlands it's coming from international sources. It's blowing in from other countries through long-range transport. The situation is very different if you look on the right-hand side for Poland, where the contribution from street and urban sources is very much higher, and less contribution is coming from international sources in this instance. The color of the bars also reflect the different individual sources, the emission sources of fine particulate matter. So in the case of Poland, you see quite a large contribution from the yellow shading, which links back to this household heating, use of solid fuel there for heating and then sometimes cooking purposes still. Whereas if we shift our attention back to the Netherlands, the contribution of the green bars shows this is particulate matter which is formed from so-called secondary sources of particulate matter. So other pollutants such as ammonia, which is released from the agricultural sector. And this is also why Veronica highlighted very nicely as well, and also Elena, the importance of taking a multi-pollutant perspective when it's considered measures to address air pollution. Just before closing on this rather complex, admittedly complex slide, I would say another key message from our side that we push very heavily is that the complex nature of sources means it's important that air pollution is tackled at different governance levels. It's not just enough to tackle air pollution at the local source, but conversely, it's not just enough to tackle air pollution at the international scale either. It's why we have a kaleidoscope of different measures and different governance mechanisms from the international to the local that are needed to address this problem. I mentioned in my introduction as well, an important part of the work that we do is to disseminate information on environmental problems to the citizens and policymakers, decision makers across Europe. This is just an example that shows the European Air Quality Index. Now, the previous maps that I presented were very much the official data reported by member states. It comes to us up to 18 months after the measurement has been taken, because member states need some time to process, to quality check, and to verify that information. And it's that information, the official information, which is used in compliance procedures, for example, by the European Commission and the courts. This information is a different data stream called up-to-date information, or basically near real time. So monitoring stations make a measurement, and within a couple of hours, that data is appearing on our website and in different services across Europe to inform on the latest status of air quality. So it's very much hourly information which we portray and disseminate. And we're continually pushing the countries, and very much supported by Veronica's team, in trying to make sure that information becomes more and more available earlier and earlier. So we're also exploring using this near real-time information to basically generate more up-to-date maps of air quality across Europe as well. So here you see, whereas the official map was for 2018, this map was the annual picture across 2019 based on this up-to-date information. So I think it's also a message that was raised by the European Court of Auditors in their recent report on air pollution legislation implementation across Europe, the need to improve the timeliness aspect. And as I say, it's a particular focus of our activities at the moment, together with the colleagues in the Commission and indeed the countries. Also mentioned in the introduction to our session this morning by our President was, of course, the impacts of air quality resulting from COVID measures. This chart shows, it appears rather complex, but what the blue bars show is the long-term average of nitrogen dioxide for the past 5 years for the month of April. And in contrast, the red bars show the percentage reduction that we saw this year as a result of decreased activity levels in many of our cities through lockdown measures, of course. It's very clear that the implementation of many lockdown measures particularly affected the ways that we work, the ways that we travel, the ways that we deliver goods across our societies. And particularly in urban areas, we were seeing some very striking reductions as a result of those measures put into place. In some countries, up to around 65% improvement in air quality in O2 levels. The chart shows as well, particularly for the larger member states, Spain, France, the United Kingdom and Italy, the larger member states that had this, probably the stricter or amongst the most strict lockdown measures in the month of April, we saw the largest reductions. Air pollution as well, there's two different dimensions I would like to highlight when it comes to the COVID story. One is you would have seen reported in much of the media that there are increasingly links being drawn between vulnerable communities who are exposed to higher levels of air pollution long term, and it also turns out they appear more vulnerable to the impacts of COVID. So they have worse health outcomes following infection by the COVID virus. So this link between long-term exposure to air pollution and other environmental health factors, disease, respiratory, viral infections is very clear, and unfortunately, once again, reiterated by the latest pandemic, in this case for COVID. The other area where there's a lot of research going on in which we don't see any clear signals yet, but it needs further study, is the link of air pollution in spreading the virus itself. So there are a number of research teams looking at to see whether the virus can, for example, attach itself to fine particulate matter in the atmosphere, which can then contribute to its spread as this fine particulate matter is transported around our streets and our cities. This is the same information, but just showing you a bit more of a comprehensive picture of the reductions of NO2 that we saw across Europe. So again, just iterating, in some cities, you can see around Madrid, southern Spain, for example, reductions of around 65% were seen. I think in terms of general messages, of course, the measures that were put in place as a result to manage the COVID outbreak are not the type of measures that we anticipate or ever want to see in order to address air pollution. But there is a systemic point here that I would like to make, that it does show on one hand the type of reductions that can be achieved if we as societies think about some more transformative changes. If we think about the ways we use our mobility systems, our reliance on individual vehicles, more structured measures that encourage a change to greener, more sustainable options can and do have the potential to lead to significant improvements in air quality in the future. It's very clear. Now, in the short perspective, as I say, of these different snapshots of different elements of the air pollution information in Europe, I would like to leave you with four conclusions from our side. One is very much a positive message. Policies are working. We do see improvements in air quality, whether it's seeing these downward trajectories on the slides of the concentrations of different pollutants in Europe. Veronica mentioned as well the important improvements we've seen in the numbers of premature deaths since 1990. Around 950,000, 1 million people died early because of air pollution back in 1990. That number has more than halved in the present day. And it's important that we further make efforts to reduce that more, which is the key point for number 2. There is still an unacceptable level of harm occurring from air pollution. Air pollution is an issue that the public particularly repeatedly signal as an important issue for them. And increasingly, as we have seen, there's bottom-up citizens initiatives also through the courts, through public or private prosecutions being brought forward by NGOs such as Client Earth, are really forcing decision makers to act more clearly and more firmly against air pollution. I mentioned the importance issue of scale, of governance. We don't have one single measure. There is no golden bullet solution, no clear solution to addressing the complex situation of air pollution. It does require action at different scales, whether it's local, national, or international. The important perspective here is very much that we need this systemic reflection about the measures that we're putting in place. and increasingly the need for more integrated solutions. I mentioned the importance of the transport system, for example. We've seen huge improvements in the energy system across Europe, more and more renewable sources of energy being put in place to replace what in many countries used to be primarily fossil fuel derived sources of energy. One challenge we have not addressed yet particularly well as a society is, of course, the food system. The way we transport food across Europe, the way we transport many food items into Europe from overseas, often not using sustainable forms of transport, many thousands of heavy-duty vehicle movements every one of our day on each day as a result of the food distribution system that we have in place, and the importance of agriculture as a source of many pollutants as well. That's going to be quite a challenge for us, I think, across the next decade. But we know solutions are there, and cost-effective solutions, importantly enough. And so with that, I would just like to stop and thank you for your attention. Thank you, Mr. President.
So thank you very much, Mr. Adams, for this insightful presentation on the scientific background of the policy of the European Union. And so now we know that the rules introduced and imposed by the European Union have a clear objective, and it seems that they also are working relatively well if you see the results so far. So may I ask the other panelists to come to the virtual podium for our discussion. I don't know if, yes, okay, thank you. So we received some interesting questions. Maybe they are not all of them we can answer ourselves here, because for example, the first question from Justice Burlakov from the Supreme Court of Ukraine is dealing in fact with the European Convention on Human Rights and Article 8 of it. So you know that, let's say, serious infringements or serious environmental problems can be in certain conditions considered to be a violation of the right to the protection of private and family life, and also severe cases of air pollutions. We have in the case law of the European Court of Human Rights some of those cases, and the court is affirming that there is a positive duty of the states to tackle, to try to prevent and restore this situation. But this question, but maybe it was more a question for the conference which was held earlier this week, because there was on Monday a very important conference with the European Court of Human Rights on human rights and the protection of the environment. Can this article be interpreted in a more preventive way? But I think we will try maybe to think about this question and to try to come back to it tomorrow, because it's not about UNICEF and it's not about the European Union. But then we have, I think, for lawyers, an important question from Justice Tonnet from the Court of Appeal of Mons about the UNICEF Air Convention and protocols. Question which is important for national judges. Is this convention what we call directly applicable? So which means that citizens within the member states can rely on it before the court or not, or is there any information about this, how this is seen within the UNICEF region, or are there differences between the parties on that? I don't know if you have some information about this.
Yes, thank you. If you allow me, I have indeed seen this question from Françoise Tonnet regarding measurement of traffic pollution from a busy road and but like implications for the health of people living nearby. Well, I want to clarify that the convention and the protocol deals with the pollution at the national level and at the transboundary level. We don't deal with the local pollution. However, if we talk about a party to the Gothenburg Protocol, it means that this country has taken on it the obligations to follow and to observe the emission limit values that are stipulated in the protocol. And for example, Annex 8 to the protocol mentions emission limit values for different types of vehicles, for different types of fuel and engines. And by that, it means that this country has to transpose these requirements into its national legislation. So it means that if it's a party to the Gothenburg Protocol, it has to comply with specific standards. However, we for compliance review, we only look at national totals.
Mm-hmm. So thank you. Maybe we have a similar question for Director Manfredi concerning the parallel European legislation, especially the Air Quality Directive and also the National Emission Savings Directive. So
I wanted to complement actually what Mrs. Novikova just said, because typically the regulatory standards that are in the UNICEF Convention and its related protocols are very much the ones that we have under European law, actually in a number of areas, if I may say, a bit less stringent. So I would say for Dimon's colleague, typically he will have a better legal basis for enforcement under European law and source legislation, but it's true that the reference also to the international duties of Belgium to fully comply with international setting are very, very important. Legally speaking, from what I've seen, we tend to refer a lot to the UNICEF Convention, there where we have major transboundary situations of lack of compliance. For national situations and for theory local ones, typically it could be European law that really penetrates to the maximum. Thank you.
Yes, and on that issue then, can a directive as the Air Quality Directive or the National Emission Savings Directive, can this be brought by citizens before a national judge when there is a local problem where there is evidence that those air quality standards are not respected? Is this possible? So that's so-called direct effect of the Air Quality Directive, so and especially the directive on air quality, I think. So absolutely
yes, and I would say this is precisely the big added value of the jurisprudence of the Court of Justice on access to justice, because as I mentioned, strictly speaking, the directive doesn't have an explicit article on that, which could have been interpreted as meaning, essentially the directive prescribes obligation only on the member states, but the court has interpreted the spirit and the letter of the directive as de facto granting citizens, I would say, a right to breathe clean air, which then translates into the fact that they must have a legal standing and the government, sorry, should I say non-governmental association representing their interests must be granted a legal standing in front of national courts to protect, I would say, local situations. So we are very grateful, I must say, for the jurisprudence of the Court of Justice, which we believe reads well the combined impact of the recitals and the provisions of the directive to deploy its full benefits.
And maybe there is a difference to make between the directive on air quality standards, which are regulating the quality of the air everywhere, so also on the local level.
Yes, and concentration.
Yes, and then maybe the national emission ceilings,
yeah,
which is more similar to the convention, because this is setting national targets. So maybe that's not so easy to say, and these are the implications for a local situation, because then you look at the whole member state, I suppose.
Correct. So I would say, you know, if I were to make a legal case myself, I would certainly try to find the right legal hooks in the ambient air quality directives. But as I said, you can always complement your reasoning by recalling the international duties of the member state, the fact that in an event a country has set to itself certain overarching emission reduction standards, which if you combine the lack of failures in several local situations will never be met if. So I would say can be used as a reinforcing argument, but you are absolutely right, President. The NACD is rather addressed to the individual member states as such. So less of a direct effect indeed, directly applicable effect.
So thank you. And then maybe a question which is directed both to Director Manfredi and Mr. Adams, because we have seen from the results that globally air quality is improving, but there are still problems here and there in respecting the air quality standards, and sometimes maybe also the national emission ceiling. But at the same time, from a scientific perspective, you have indicated that the World Health Organization standards, which are based really, as you said, on science and the impact on human health and so on, are calling for an even stricter approach. And at the end, you mentioned, but there are cost-effective measures possible to introduce to realize it, because as Director Manfredi said, within the European Green Deal, one is thinking about making those standards more strictly. But the question, of course, is this feasible from a technological point of view, from an economic point of view? Because we may be promoting such thing, but the member states finally have to agree within the council on this, and arguments that maybe this will hamper economic activities and then has a negative impact on income and well-being of the population. And as Mr. Adams said, looking to the figures, so also the income situation of the people, there is a correlation with impacts of air pollution and so on. So can you elaborate a little bit on this? So what are the perspectives that the European Union legislation will be, let's say, upgraded towards this World Health standard? So yesterday, the European Parliament was pushing for the climate, the climate change objectives. Will this happen also on the more classical air pollution issues? So perhaps maybe first Mr. Adams, and then
yeah, perhaps if I start, and I'm sure the other panelists would have some interesting perspectives too. We know in Europe, if we were to achieve the WHO standards everywhere in Europe at the moment, we would save around 200,000 premature deaths a year. So that number of 400,000 would in essence be vastly reduced just if we could reach the WHO standard. So I think that's a very important message. What I would also like to do when we talk about air pollution measures is maybe make two comments. One is, Mr. President, you very importantly pointed to the climate area. Many of the actions that we see being put in place for climate have very important co-benefits also for air pollution. So, for example, initiatives to reduce, lower, eliminate the use of fossil fuels, we know will lead to very important improvements in the air that we breathe as well. And indeed, I've seen some commentators referring to the UNFCCC Paris Agreement, not only as a climate change agreement, but also as a health agreement, because of these important improvements that will deliver co-benefits in other areas as well. I would also make the link perhaps to COVID as well, where I think we have almost a generational opportunity at the moment to really think about this huge amount of money that is going into the post-COVID economic recovery measures. And I think the European Parliament, many non-governmental organizations, civil society, but also interestingly businesses as well, are seeing the opportunity for these recovery measures probably to have three different dimensions. One is it's important that they are forward-looking, it's important that they are green, and it's important that it does actually lead to an improved resilience for our societies and economies, not just against shocks of future pandemics, but also, of course, that we can have an increased resilience against these long-term climate and environment problems as well. And I'd also sort of take this opportunity to hand over perhaps to Veronica, who I know her colleagues are working very much on the sort of the cost-benefit perspective of some of these policy options that we have.
President, various angles through which to reply to your question. So first of all, of course, I fully agree with what Martin just said. Paradoxically, COVID has created a situation which is giving now an opportunity to build back better, and with the financial support that is supposed to come not only from public budget, but also by a very interesting public and private financing mechanism, which is very innovative in its conception. And I think it creates really a very, very kind of new wind. But more importantly, I think for me, at the basis of your question is the answer, can we really get there technologically? And you know, before even we started discussing the idea and the political appropriateness of having a zero pollution target for the European Union as we have it today, I have engaged extensively with the industry. And I'm always fascinated that I hardly ever hear the word, it's impossible. No one in the industrial sector is telling me that it's impossible. Everyone is telling me it's a matter of milestones, accompanying. So it means the technology is either there or in the pipeline. Let's face it, for certain areas more advanced than in others. I mean, an example that we always mention as an example still of complexities, for example, maritime. We recognize that in the shipping world, still research is ongoing as to whether hydrogen could be really the win-win solution. But there is no area of our economic opportunities where there is not already research ongoing and sometimes even technological solutions which are largely deployed. I think of the car sector where we already have certain brands, unfortunately all not European ones, which have embraced very strongly hydrogen, which cuts basically all of the pollutant and greenhouse gas emissions. For me, the key message that I get both from industry, but also I would say from consumers, so it's interesting, they want that every euro they spend on whatever is the next technological innovation, and consumer, whatever euro they spend on the next product, brings them something that has multi-benefits. So for me, the responsibility that we have as regulators, as policymakers, and supported by the scientific evidence that the colleagues of the EA and other agencies bring to us, is how to devise a regulatory framework and policy activities that point to the need, as from now, with Horizon Europe, our research and innovation programs, to really boost technological research that cuts at the same time pollutant emission, greenhouse gases, possibly creates co-benefits indeed from a biodiversity perspective, resource efficiency, use of water. This is what the industry and ultimately the consumers are looking for. If with the same euro, they can invest in something that is really a winning technology, they will do it. And I understand that this increases their competitiveness in the long run, because you see, we have a colleague from UNICEF with us. The cooperation with the United Nations is amazing. And I must say, among all the work strands of what we do under environment, but also health perspectives, we are really engaged with them. So we know that it's not only Europe, it's the world that progressively is moving towards that. But there is a race from an economic viewpoint for who are going to be the best ones and the fastest ones in winning this battle. So somehow European industry is also kind of, telling us, go, but support us and stay on our side. Of course, we will all compete based on, full respect of WTO rules and who is the best and must get it. But there is really an interesting market out there.
So thank you. Maybe the similar question to Ms. Novikova. You see that with the new European Commission and the Green Deal, there is a lot of ambition and enthusiasm, in fact, to change things. So the question is, because you mentioned also that there is a review now, also on the UNICEF level, on the objectives, how this debate, economic possibilities, technological possibilities, and strengthening emission reduction targets is seen within the pan-European level.
Thank you very much for this question. Well, the review of the Gothenburg Protocol has just been launched. So we don't know yet. Maybe we will know in 1 or 2 years what will be the result of this review. Yes, there is on one hand an ambition from the European part to move further and to bring ourselves closer to WHO standards. However, there is, we should not forget that there is an eastern part of UNEC region, and where the access to most advanced technologies is more limited. And basically we have to take everything into consideration to still make it possible for the ECA countries, as we call them, countries in Eastern Europe, the Caucasus and Central Asia, still possible to join these instruments and to include some flexibilities for this instrument to make it viable for the European countries, to make it interesting and ambitious enough, and at the same time doable for the Eastern countries, so to say. So it will be a challenge for parties within the next 2 or 3 years or more. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So I don't know if that have been introduced meanwhile. Additional questions? I'm looking to Katalin, if you...
Thank you, Kiap. So I'm Katalin Shuyok. I'm the drafter of the the summary report for this questionnaire, and I would have one question to Ms. Manfredi. So I found your presentation very interesting, and I was very glad that you made a specific remark on the role of NGOs and NGO-driven litigation to enforce EU air pollution law. And actually, that was a point that come up also in the answers from judge members of this organization. So the report also comments on it. And this is why I am particularly interested in how do you see the EU Commission's potential role in fostering the role of NGOs and helping them to discharge their very beneficial role of fostering the national enforcement of EU air pollution laws. So how to see whether the Commission can foster access to justice rights on the domestic level and the EU level in the future?
Thank you, Mrs. Sulio. And first of all, many, many thanks for your report, which I have, read, not with the degree of detail I want to read it, but it has already given me a lot of food for thought, and I think it will be on my on the table next to my bed for the weekend, because I really want to digest it fully. So it's an extremely interesting input that adds to the findings of our REFIT evaluation. The official reply to your question will come next Wednesday. The college will adopt what we call the ARUS package, which contains at the same time a specific recommendation to all the member states about how to secure better access to justice nationally. And also we're looking into the overarching regulation granting access to civil society organization for the modification of legislative acts adopted by the EU institutions. So it's a really very important package. I suppose all the colleagues on this call will appreciate kind of digesting it at full. But the key essential policy message is, I believe this is an area where we must engage more. When I found out with my colleagues that essentially we see a little bit on Europe à différentes vitesses. So you saw that some of the ruling of the Court of Justice are activated by a wonderful NGO like Client Earth, or I mean, there are a few others that have really been very active, and this has led to changes in policy legislation, in the UK, in Germany, there where they have been so vividly acting, and in other member states, things are lagging behind. And let's face it, we all know in this room that there are linkages between access to justice and rule of law compliance, the democratic functioning of a system. So I think it's not just about looking at, how well things can be displayed, but also securing that all these countries evolve in a way that guarantees people the basic rights to clean air, clean water that are stemming from all our acquis and our treaty ultimately. So I believe we must focus on this as an area of priority. Thank you.
So thank you very much. So maybe for those who are not aware of it, the Aarhus Convention is of course also the convention of UNICEF, and there are some different institutions working with the Aarhus Convention. One is the Task Force on Access to Justice, which is of course something very close to the judiciary, and I've learned that the next item for work and study will be the same as we are talking about. It will be on air pollution and the role of access to justice and of NGOs and citizens that subject. So I think we are approaching the end of our first day. So I would like to, is there another question coming? No. Otherwise, I think we have.
Sorry, from Ms. Lahtinen from Finland, I think.
Okay, so please, the last question before the closure. Yes, okay. Yes, you can speak now. No, seems to be a problem. So maybe we can pose the question in the chat. Or can you hear us? No, there is a problem, I think. So I propose that we collect the question through the chat and that we close now our first day session. So I like to thank all the panelists. So I think we have set the scene for the tomorrow discussions. Farah, do you have something to add on the practical aspects of next day? Okay.
No, I wanted to thank you, President, our speakers for their fascinating presentations. It was a wonderful first session of our first online conference of the Forum of Judges for the Environment. We hope to see you tomorrow, 10 October at 10 o'clock. And meanwhile, I hope you can improve your air quality and get there. On behalf of the EU Forum of Judges for the Environment, thanks to all you speakers, our staff, all the participants. And from Brussels, tot morgen, à demain, auf Wiedersehen, bis morgen. I'm sorry.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you so
Thank you very
much.
much. Bye bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye bye.